Right, good evening. Welcome to our panel on the uses, misuses, and limitations of Jane Jacobs. I am Juan Rivero, Special Projects Director at Village Preservation, and I'm going to first say a few words of introduction. Village Preservation is a neighborhood preservation organization focused on Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. Since 1980, we have been documenting and celebrating these neighborhoods, fighting to stop inappropriate development in them while encouraging appropriate development and advocating on behalf of their cultural institutions and independent small businesses. In addition, we host about 75 free programs per year, like this one. Our events cover a wide range of topics related to our neighborhood's history, architecture, culture, and development. We're a member-based organization, so your support is essential to our capacity to provide this free programming and continue our advocacy and preservation work. If you like what we do, consider joining us and making a donation at villagepreservation.org. Maya's going to be dropping the link in the chat. So let's get started. This book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding. This rhetorical equivalent of a right-hand lead, to put it in boxing terms, is the opening of the most famous critique written about planning, Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities from 1961. And she doesn't stop there. In the pages that follow, she goes on to compare planning to the pseudoscience of bloodletting, quote, a plethora of subtle and complicated dogma that has arisen on a foundation of nonsense, unquote. It is ironic then that Jacobs continues to be evoked to this day as a guiding light in planning discussion, both explicitly and through the embrace of her arguments and concepts. Just a few months ago, the mayor and governor assembled 57 top businesses and community leaders to produce a report on how to make New York the best place to work in the world. The words vibrant, diversity, and mixed use appear 79 times in this document. I counted them, so you won't have to. So this persistence of Jacobs' work is all the more surprising since it was written in response to a very different set of circumstances. And it is fair then to question its relevance today. I'm going to leave that question to our panelists, but to better frame this discussion, I will first take a few moments to locate Jane Jacobs' work in this historical context and highlight some of her main arguments and concepts. So first, the city. Jane Jacobs made her observations during this paradoxical juncture in the history of local development that married a seemingly intractable cycle of economic and demographic decline with a seemingly unshakable optimism in our ability to solve urban problems through the application of technical expertise. After a mid-century period of economic and cultural ascendancy, New York had started to suffer the effects of trends that, on the one hand, directed investment out of the city, along with those with the means to follow, and on the other hand, engendered delightful conditions within the city center. These trends included the government-subsidized relocation of industry away from its traditional urban locations, government-subsidized suburban residential development, racially discriminatory practices in both neighborhood and workplace, and a national Cold War-era suspicion of any progressive anti-poverty policy that carried the whiff of communism. These mutually reinforcing trends would eventually fan the often literal flames of an urban crisis, but not before the city planning apparatus got on the case and substantially reconfigured our urban fabric. So planning. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when if you had said, I'm a planner, the response would have been, tell me more. This was that heady time. Having coalesced into a profession a few decades before through efforts to keep societal collapse from inhibiting further industrial urban growth, planning had, by the mid-century, acquired the Enlightenment trappings of a science, including a faith in scientific principles, technology, and progress. The era's planning knowledge, which had already been shaped by attempts to confront the overcrowding and noxious uses of the industrial city, easily assimilated prominent utopian urban visions that prioritize urban space, the segregation of uses, and simplified form. Visions that rationalize urban space to make them more legible and efficient. When federal funding turbocharged the broad application of this planning expertise through urban renewal programs, the results involved, and I'll show you. Am I sharing the screen?
Yeah. No, it's just you.
Now?
Yes.
Yes.
Involved the clearing of small-scale neighborhoods understood to be messy, crowded, and economically and socially marginal, and then their replacement with a series of identical, exclusively residential towers regularly arranged amidst a sea of open space within consolidated mega blocks. Eventually, these projects inspired a backlash. Jacobs' boys formed part of a small chorus of activists, writers, academics, and gentrifiers who decried the dehumanizing scale and the sensorial monotony of urban renewal towers, and who, by way of contrast, shone a favorable light on the liveliness of traditional urban neighborhoods, which were stamped with the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Neighborhoods not unlike the one where Jacobs herself lived, Greenwich Village. Using this neighborhood as a point of reference, Jacobs lays some of the blame for the city's decline on a planning approach that ignored the disjuncture between the formal organization that it tried to impose from above and the inherent functional order of the actual city as it is experienced from below. She derived these ideas about the city's functional order using the street block as her unit of analysis, and famously illustrated those ideas through a decontextualized but highly evocative description of the vivid ritual of harmonious social interactions that unfolded just outside her own window. This sidewalk ballet of community depended on several conditions, according to Jacobs. A diversity of functions, so to achieve a 24/7 street life, live, work, shopping, playing, and so forth. Small street blocks, which make possible a more varied and stimulating pedestrian experience. A diversity of buildings close to the street and low enough to encourage street life, and also including old buildings, which rent for less and therefore accommodate a greater commercial mix. And a density of diverse people who can support a wide range of uses and amenities. Jacobs also identified several conditions that can interfere with these mutually enhancing types of diversity, including a real estate domination by a singular, more profitable use or by more affluent residents. So in other words, gentrification in different terms. The introduction of physical barriers like highways, and either the lack or overabundance of financing available for development, which she called cataclysmic money. Finally, she identified a number of policy remedies for these problems, including a housing subsidy scheme that sounded a bit like tenant-based Section 8, infill development, not unlike what is being contemplated right now for some NYCHA campuses, the introduction of mixed-use zoning into monofunctional districts, and she uses Lower Manhattan and the South Street Seaport as an example before multiple uses have been introduced there. A series of regulatory restrictions of building heights, not to freeze conditions, but to ensure that changes don't happen all at once. This included things like height restrictions and historic districts. And lastly, the development of more lively neighborhoods that might offer an escape valve for demand pressures on existing ones. So if a lot of this sounds like common sense, that only speaks to the influence of her critique. We believe that a vital street life and neighborhood diversity are good things and that they can lead to other good things. And we believe that our development plans can either support these conditions or undermine them. But is that right? And so today we're posing that question at a time when, on the one hand, many of Jacobs' design prescriptions have become a matter of planning orthodoxy, and on the other, several of the forces of decline that she identified, cataclysmic money, gentrification, etc., have greatly intensified. So enough of context. We're now going to hear from our distinguished speakers, who in order of appearance will be Christine Boyer, Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at the Princeton University School of Architecture and the author of such classics as Dreaming the Rational City and The City of Collective Memory. Susan Feinstein, Senior Research Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the author of such classics as City Builders and the Just City. And Sharon Sukin, Professor Emerita of Sociology at Brooklyn College and at the CUNY Graduate Center, and the author of such classics, there's a lot of classics here, as Loft Living and the Culture of Cities. Each of them will speak, then I will ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function for submitting questions at any point. You don't have to wait till the end. If we have time, or if I just don't understand your question, I might promote you to speaker so that you may post that question yourself. So don't go anywhere. More likely though, I'll be relaying that question for you. Now, there are many of you. If we don't get to some of your questions, we may still try to subsequently address them in some fashion. And with that, I leave you with Christine.
All right. Thank you, Juan. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Juan, for organizing this panel and for setting us up so nicely about Jane Jacobs. I am going to speak very briefly about a very complicated process, and I have lots of comments about what I think Jane Jacobs did to the West Village or didn't do to the West Village. So let me begin. Maybe this slide says it all. What would she have thought about today, about the far West Village? The far West Village seems to be a marketing term for anything west of Hudson Street in the territory that Jane Jacobs lived. And what would she think of the super luxury amenities of the Hudson River Park? Next slide, please. Now, Jane Jacobs lived at this house on Hudson Street from 1946, I think, to 1968. The realty company is the facade of that house now. But this 14-block area of the West Village was threatened by one of Robert Moses's urban renewal schemes. And once that he got his hands on it and designated it a slum area, it was going to be razed and it was going to be replaced by the high-rise buildings and higher rent individuals coming in that Juan has just explained and shown with, yes, what is it called? Cataclysmic money or something on that order. So this area of the West Village, and it's always amazing to me to talk about the history of what some of the West Side districts really looked like in the time that Jane Jacobs was living there. But it was a mixture of factories and tenements and row houses with a largely Puerto Rican population. Next, please. Now, the West Village Committee's plan, which Jane Jacobs actually was a co-organizer with, along with Dr. Donald Donaldson. They had a plan to try to save the West Village, and it organized from 61 to 69. They knew that the area needed improvement. They knew that it needed coats of paint and better sanitation allowances for cars, because underneath the elevated on West Street was used as a parking lot, and that elevated was coming down. You can see parts of it over there on the left screen. Now, the committee's concern were how to keep the neighborhood diverse, and Juan has talked about this, how to ensure its diversity of income levels, and how to help a mixture of land uses continue to exist rather than to go out of existence. The West Village was a small town, and Jane Jacobs liked that character. Now the committee, and I also like this, and that's why I put the writing up there, whatever the plans proposed, not a single tenant or property owner would be hurt. And secondly, they would operate by consensus, not a single person who objected to the smallest issue would be overlooked or not listened to or not considered. And so that is what she had hoped for in the committee to save the West Village. Next slide. Well, they won the battle. They won the battle. And so the committee to save the West Village felt it was safe. So they changed their name to the West Village Committee. And now they had another idea, and that was, could they begin to build affordable housing in the West Village? And the area that was being considered was from Bank Street south to Morton Street between Washington and West Street. And it was to be the first infill housing from New York City, now called the Jane Jacobs houses. And they were built and opened in the mid-1970s. Now, Jane Jacobs, along with the community activist Rachel Wall, proposed co-op row house, but the designs by the architects Perkins and Wills were not acceptable to Jane. They had lost all the features she had proposed, and she actually despised these Jane Jacob houses, as they're now referred to. In their place, a group of 42 six-story walk-ups were built. You can see the images on either side of the logo. Evidence of design, which she would say was the lowest denominator. An editorial in the New York Times of 1974 called the houses, quote, unplanned monuments to a system geared to sabotage, meaning the committee's work, and a city determined to red tape itself to death, end of quote. And all of this after a decade and more of struggle to save the West Village and to get affordable housing built in the West Village. Next slide, please. So what happened to the West Village after Jane Jacobs left in 1968? Well, after a 4-year fight, Greenwich Village Historic District was designated in 1969, but its boundaries left much of the waterfront area of Washington Street and all of West Street outside of the district of landmark protection. You can see the red line over there on the left of the boundary lines of the Greenwich Village. Zoning didn't protect the village either. Until the early 2020s, the far West Village was largely zoned for manufacturing, although such activities had long since abandoned the area. And high-rise development, as you can see from one of the renovated piers, high-rise development and the demolition of historic properties were spreading throughout the village. The waterfront from Bank Street to Charles Street was largely built up with high-rises, which you're looking at. In 2005, the 14-block area of the far West Village, from Horatio to Washington Street, Morton, West Street, underwent a downzoning that cut back bulk, lowered heights, eliminated large bars and clubs. Its intent was to keep high-rise housing from being built in the area. Next slide, please. And meanwhile, the poor waterfront was left as a derelict waterfront, barbed wire, abandoned warehouses, crumbling piers, parking lots, and so on. But fortunately, the proposed highway, the Westway, was temporarily stopped in 1982, but the struggle for a waterfront park continued to go on. The proposed highway was permanently stopped in 1985. Fortunately, the Hudson River striped bass whose spawning grounds appeared to locate around the derelict pier structures, the proposed highway was permanently stopped because of them. Then the proposed alternative underground tunnel for the Westway Highway that would have dumped its soil onto those piers was also abandoned, partly because of the striped bass. Thanks for, for the protest over that, which was long and consuming, but anyway. But mainly the highway, the tunnel that was going to suppress the highway was just too expensive to construct. And West Street then was transformed into a so-called 6-lane landscaped boulevard, beginning in 1987 and finally completed in 2001, and it stretches from the Battery to 59th Street with a planned 550-acre waterfront park. Legislation for that park, the Hudson River Park as it is now known, was finally passed in 1998. The comprehensive plan was designed by the landscape architecture firm of MLA with the principal Signe Nielsen, setting down design guidelines for the 550-acre park. Next slide, please. So now you can see what I can enjoy. I happen to live in the West Village and take my dog walking on all these lovely parks, which are really super wonderful, except I'm not allowed on the little islands, only by mistake once with my dog. But anyway, by 2020, the Hudson River Park along the far West Village waterfront and further north has been largely completed. Pier 26 has been renovated. Gansevoort Peninsula, which is down at the bottom of the slide on the right, has just been opened a few weeks ago. It's not completed, but it's little sandy beaches there. No dogs allowed, however. Pier 55, Pier 57, Pier 97, and the little island designed by Signe Nielsen, who was also the designer of the plan for the West Side Park. Next slide, please. Well, we have a lot of luxury parks, but now another problem has arisen. A 2013 proposal was made to expand the use of transfer of development rights from commercial nodes within Hudson River Park, 1 block inland from the park. And so it was feared that this would mean over super duper development, as has happened to the north along the High Line. I'm not talking about the High Line, but there's a whole other story. But you can see what the height here, which you don't develop, can be added to this over there. Then in September of 2023, not so long ago, Mayor Adams released the City of Yes housing proposal in September. He intends the city to share 500,000 affordable units within every New York City neighborhood. The West Village is vulnerable. For the entire Greenwich Village residents have an average income of $170,000. And it has added less than 50 units of affordable housing within how many years, I don't know, because what I was reading left the years unspecified. But the intention of the mayor's plan is to share the incredible amenities of the far West Side Village with lower income residents. Within the City of Yes proposal, there lies another push to extend the air rights of TDRs to enable an increase in the number of high-rise structures. The receiving transfer districts would be larger and community reviews would be lessened. Development rights could be transferred, not from just landmark structures to adjacent properties or across the street properties, but to anywhere on a landmark block, and from that block across the street or catty corner from the block. In addition, the floor area ratio, the bulk and height could be transferred, would allow more than the current 20% increase in height to an unspecified amount as the mayor's plan stands at this moment. Obviously, historic preservation are outraged. The fear is that the future might look like Hudson Yards super development. Next slide, please. So just south of the Far West Village is the empty lot of 388 Hudson Street, owned by the city of New York. It has proposed since 2021 to build 100 units of affordable housing. It's far enough away from the borders of the West Village, so it might be allowed. Housing is drastic. Low-income housing or affordable housing, which is not low-income housing, but anyway, that's a whole other argument, is drastically needed in the West Village. It has long been promised to be developed. This particular block, which you're looking at in the corner of the upper right, has long been promised to be turned into a park, but the compromise seemed to be a lower bulky building instead, and that is in the lower right corner of the park. But instead, with all of these new bonuses and so on, what this summer, what the city has proposed is to erect a 355-foot structure, the tallest one in Greenwich Village. And the affordable units would not be permanently set aside, but they would have a lifespan of, let's say, 30 years. So next slide, please. Now, there's lots more to the story, and I'm running through it very quickly, but what would Jane Jacobs think? She wanted a neighborhood of mixed income and mixed uses, just the way the village was in the 50s and 60s. Well, on the far west side, we have none of that, or the far west village, none of that, as has been explained. She wanted also all land use decisions to involve the community and to be decided by consensus. Well, if Mayor Adams has his way, there'll be a decline in the involvement of community groups. They seem to be pesky and in the way of streamlining any development. She asked for quality affordable housing, even though she was terribly critical, as Juan has told us, of both architects and city planners. And this is a major problem of some of the legacy of Jane Jacobs. But she would have seen to it that the super amenities that the West Village has in Hudson River Park would be shared by all. And that would have included a fair share of parks on both sides of the East River and within the Bronx community as well. Next slide, please. If we take the Far West Village as an example of community control, of overlapping land use regulations which have no physical plan for development, plus a series of mayors who have failed to provide affordable housing in sufficient numbers, then you get a turbocharged real estate market and wealthy residents, both of whom, the market and the residents, will resist any mixture of incomes or fulfilling any share of affordable housing. So let's remember what Jane Jacobs claimed: conscience is the ultimate weapon. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Next up is Susan.
Okay. Well, I don't have the kind of wonderful pictures that Christine has, and so I will just talk.
Kill the slideshow until you're cued, William, please.
No, I don't bother with the slides except when I tell you to. Jane Jacobs started out by really being concerned with streets and traffic. And if you look at her book, she says that she became, and she uses this term, a public character by joining in the battle to save Washington Square Park from being bisected by a highway. And you have to say that we can't even imagine Greenwich Village now if that highway had gone through and the park had been destroyed. It was a heroic stance at a time when traffic engineers thought that their only purpose in life was to make traffic move as quickly and freely as possible. She also led the opposition to the widening of Hudson Street. And this is a quote from the book. the Manhattan borough engineers decided to cut 10 feet off our sidewalks. This was part of a mindless, routinized city program of vehicular road widening. And this was true not just in New York, but it was true all over the country. It was generally thought that the reason for urban decline was that people couldn't drive their cars fast enough, couldn't find places to park, and so they preferred the suburbs because America is a car-centered society, and the suburbs gave them a way to drive their cars, park their cars, and use their cars to get to wherever they wanted to go. So she generally opposed this idea that suburban outmigration was caused by traffic issues. Although I do remember my own mother saying, well, I never go down, we lived outside of Cleveland, Ohio. I never go downtown anymore because the traffic is so bad. And it certainly was not just Robert Moses's idea or sentiment, but it was a widespread sentiment among Americans that if you wanted to go somewhere, you got in your car and got there in it. But she understood that accessible public space and sidewalk activity were in fact attractions, not just obstacles to people's realization of what they wanted to do. And also her opposition to the automobile now seems to us very prescient, that of course at that time nobody was thinking about climate change and global warming, but now we believe in reducing car traffic precisely because of its effect on the climate. Yuan talked about her emphasis, and so did Christine, her emphasis on mixed use and density. And she was, of course, generalizing from her Greenwich Village experience. So here's another quotation. The many small-scale non-residential uses on the street have been increasing and are responsible for much of the increased attractiveness and value of the street for residents. If the neighborhood were to lose the industries, it would be a disaster for us residents. Or if the industries were to lose us residents, enterprise would disappear. Now, this is in a way she's describing what has now come to be called the urban doom loop, that when, in fact, businesses disappear, then the people who use the shops and the restaurants disappear, and then the attraction of the area for residents also disappears, and the tax benefits disappear, and so that you have a kind of desertion of the city. And we're at a juncture now where we, don't quite know what's going to happen as we see all the vacant storefronts. She uses this term, the street ballet. But one of the questions about this picture of the busy, active street is now that we see all these vacant storefronts around New York, what can one do to, in fact, reactivate the street if we're not going to see so many people working in offices who are then going to go to the restaurants and shop in the stores? New York, because of course, much of what Jane Jacobs argued has become the new orthodoxy of planners, that the zoning requires that new buildings, new residential buildings, have space for street level retail. But we now see all this vacant street level retail storefronts. And what do we do about them? And what do we fill them up with? And filling them up with urgent medical care facilities and pet, veterinarians doesn't necessarily create lively things to look at. So this is a new problem for planning. Her call for diversity has, in fact, been incorporated into zoning for mixed uses, but simply creating a variety of building heights and uses in the zoning doesn't actually necessarily create a variety of uses and street activity. She very importantly said that high density should not be confused with overcrowding, which was many people did make that confusion at the time. She discusses the unslumming of the West Village. And she attributes that in part to immigration. And she considers Puerto Ricans immigrants, which is, of course, not exactly correct view of people from Puerto Rico. But at any rate, she then claims that, quote, people are accommodated and assimilated. The immigrants, ours happen to be mostly Puerto Rican, and they are going to make a fine middle class quickly assimilate. Well, in fact, if you look at population change in the village, it's no longer very heavily Puerto Rican at all, and that she thought that people would stay. But in fact, there is an attraction to the suburbs, and many, especially of immigrants, had an ideal of the American dream, which was a suburban house, not living in a mixed use district. She calls for making credit available for housing rehabilitation and argues that the transformation of the village is attributable to the improved economic circumstances of current residents rather than to displacement. Well, in fact, the transformation of the village has, for the reasons that Christine pointed to, mainly been a product of displacement and the replacement of these people who were there when she was there by simply wealthier people who liked the ambiance of the village. And what she doesn't provide, in fact, is how, in fact, we are in a market society, in a market situation, going to maintain the mix of population that she wants. I happen to have participated in a tribute to Jane Jacobs in Toronto, which is where she moved after New York, because of the war in Vietnam. She was fearful that her sons would be drafted, and thus she moved to Canada and became a sort of important figure in Toronto. And what interested me about this day in honor of her was there were several panels. I was on one, but another was all economists, and they were all really neoliberal, right-wing economists who really thought she was wonderful because she was against planning. And so and she doesn't provide a mechanism really for what it is that she wants to have happen, because she doesn't think planning's going to do it. She doesn't think design is going to do it. But what is going to do it if it's not, in fact, going to be planning? Okay, now I do have a slide there of the current demographics of Greenwich Village, which I would appreciate your putting up. No, yeah. Okay, so here is the racial and ethnic composition, and I couldn't pull out just Greenwich Village, and the study that I saw has Greenwich Village and Soho. But what you see is, as between 2000 and really the present, and I don't think there's been that much change since 2021, that there's been a substantial increase in Asian population. There has been an increase in the Black population, but it's still a very small proportion of the area. An increase also in the Hispanic population, but nevertheless, the whole area remains overwhelmingly white. Next slide, please. And what you particularly see is that the income levels are very high, that the whole percentage of people, and in fact, the income levels are becoming higher. So this is in constant dollars. And what you see is that the low income proportion of the population has simply shrunk, and that 37% of the population has incomes between $100,000 and $250,000. Although I might note that affordable housing in New York, by the standards that are given for affordability, you can earn well over $100,000 and be considered eligible for affordable housing. And there's been a very big increase of the households with incomes over 250. So Jane Jacobs's vision for the village has largely been adhered to in terms of building heights, building diversity, the general appearance of the village, the blocking of highways, but nevertheless, it has not retained the population mix which she desired, and there's no way you can think of that it can, given the way in which we have private land ownership and private real estate development. Okay, you can turn off the slides. So my critique of Jane Jacobs, and afterwards I'll tell you what I think is her contribution, but that the physical composition of the city is not the main determinant of its racial, ethnic, or class composition. And then, in fact, the Brownstone Revolution, as it was called at the time, and historic preservation became stylish, and gentrification occurred, where one could easily see at her time why it was thought that affluent people would be all moving to the suburbs, that a big chunk of affluent people decided that the city was where they wanted to be. I think there's also a cultural issue in terms of what you might call the bourgeoisification, the dominance by the bourgeoisie of what were once heterogeneous areas, which is, to ask the question, well, are these actual participants in the life of the city, or are they kind of voyeurs, thinking how quaint it is to see the neighborhood butcher, or the people who still remain who might in fact be immigrants, but are they not just watching the street ballet rather than being dancers within it? There is also a question of which mixed uses are desirable, and we certainly see people now rebelling against all the sidewalk restaurants, which do attract rats and which are noisy and which do keep people up at night. And there's simply a conflict of interest between people who are living in the residential buildings and people who are wining, dining, and drinking well into the night in the cafes and restaurants and bars on the ground floors. The proportion of people in the country, or even in New York City, who desire the kind of cosmopolitan existence that she loves, is, I don't know how many it is, but it's not everybody by any means. And there's a certain assumption that runs through her book that this is the kind of life that everybody would like to lead if only they could. There is also a question of whether the kinds of movements and participation she called for overly empower veto groups. And it's often said that nothing can be done in New York because there's always a group that's going to stop it from happening. There's also a kind of architectural determinism that design, architects have always believed that design determines the world. And even though she's very opposed to the designs that architects like and is particularly opposed to the Corbusier approach to city building, she nevertheless seems to share his belief that if you design the city right, its social life will conform to her design guidelines. So I do have criticisms of her, but nevertheless, I would argue for the importance of her contribution. She clearly identified the harm caused by the orthodoxy of city planning during her era. She generally transformed the approach of planners who were seeking to impose what she sarcastically calls radiant garden city, that is a mashup of the city dreamed of by Le Corbusier and of Ebenezer Howard in the Garden City. And she inspired what is now called, or previously has been, I think this era has sort of passed too, but it's been called the new urbanism, where new developments are seeking to replicate the character of areas like Greenwich Village. Her opposition to the high-handedness of Robert Moses and her emphasis on the importance of participation by neighborhood residents was highly influential and unbalanced to the good, that we don't want to see every group having veto power, but on the other hand, we don't want to see city planners running roughshod over neighborhoods. And finally, her opposition to highway building and slum clearance and support for diversity, which developed out of her analysis of the attraction of Greenwich Village, has become dominant within the city planning profession today and allows this view of planning to overcome the tendency of traffic engineers to think that the most important thing you could do for an urban area was to move automobiles. So on the whole, her contributions have been positive. She and others, of course, who had similar views, dramatically changed the profession of city planning to make it much more sensitive to the needs of people and much less dominated by architects. And in general, to make cities places that are more pleasurable to be in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And last but not least, Sharon.
Thank you, Juan. And thanks so much to Village Preservation for bringing me to you to talk about Jane Jacobs and Soho. Now, Jane Jacobs herself was not active in Soho, but her spirit hangs over the opposition to the 2021 rezoning of Soho, NoHo, and a bit of Chinatown that Village Preservation was very active in during the past few years. The really crucial point here that both Christine suggests and Susan talks around is that New York City doesn't have planning. New York City has facilitation of what developers want to do, or a kind of divining by officials and elected officials and planners of what real estate developers want to do just around the time that developers want to do it. So I don't think that Jacob's criticism of planning is well placed. Really, what we want to criticize and what the opponents of rezoning in 2021 criticized is the priority of real estate developers, private individuals who want to tear down and rebuild, not because they have some bias against diversity, but because they want to make money. And this is something that Jane Jacobs never squarely attacked, just as Susan says, Jacobs never squarely said what government should do to make more diverse and community responsive neighborhoods, because she really did not trust government to do the right thing. So these are all issues that came to the fore during the 2021 rezoning of Soho, NoHo, and a bit of Chinatown. But I want to take us back to the time of Jane Jacobs and the sort of physical barrier that she fought, and then by moving to Toronto, left a place for other people to oppose. So could we go to my slides, please? Thank you. Next. The period of Jane Jacobs' activism in Manhattan was a period, as Susan said, of population leaving and investment going to, financial investment going to other places, leaving lower Manhattan, including the West Village, but even more so the area that came to be called Soho, as a vortex of uncertainty. A plan to build a physical barrier between the Wall Street financial district and the area that came to be called Soho and Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side and Little Italy, that is the Lower Manhattan Expressway, was proposed as far back as 1929. But there was no financial capital available to build it until after World War II ended. and the proposal to build the Lower Manhattan Expressway rose again in the 1950s. It was championed by Robert Moses. And a lot of people mistakenly think that Jane Jacobs and her allies were responsible for defeating it, but they weren't. In fact, Jane Jacobs, who opposed the Lower Manhattan Expressway plan in the early and mid-1960s, left town before the plan had definitively bitten the dust. In 1968 and 1969, the plan was resuscitated. And as one of the dancers and artists who formed Artists Against the Expressway in 1969 told me, the people who came to the meetings to oppose the expressway were, in her words, Italians, Jewish people, village intellectuals, Don, that's the late Donald Judd, and me. So that it really was neighborhood people and neighborhood activists, including Rochelle Wall, one of the, quote, village intellectuals, who later became a member of Community Board 2 when community boards were established, who opposed the Lower Manhattan Expressway, mobilized a huge amount of discontent with the expressway plan within the global art world, as well as within these neighborhoods, and threatened the mayor and local elected officials with withdrawing Democratic votes from these people when they ran for office if they continued to support the expressway. So there were actually some very complicated politics and coalitions behind the opposition to and defeat of the Lower Manhattan Expressway. Of course, if the Lower Manhattan Expressway had been built, there would have been no Soho and very little Italy, much less of the Lower East Side, and probably a real threat to the area that's called the South Village. And I don't know whether there ever would have been a Hudson Square. Okay, next, please. So many of the people who looked at Soho buildings and Soho streets, even after the first historic district designation was achieved in 1973, probably saw old buildings, dirty streets, and very little architecture of great value. I'm not sure how Jane Jacobs would have helped to keep these buildings in place and to promote the neighborhood cohesion of Soho, but there's a pretty grim look of the neighborhood despite the historic district preservation. Next slide, please. So in fact, it wasn't Jane Jacobs directly who was involved, but other people. The urban planning professor Chester Rapkin, whose plaque is now on Prince Street, actually around the Flux House that George Misuses and various artists who bought lofts from him, jazz musicians were able to preserve. And also Margot Gale and the inspiration that she brought to looking anew at these old cast iron industrial buildings and finding something of cultural value in them. So it wasn't really Jane Jacobs, it wasn't any of her ideas, it was these other people who were intellectually, culturally innovative and progressive in the 1960s who brought a different way of looking at Soho that was very much in tune with a lot of what Jane Jacobs wrote and fought for, but it wasn't Jacobs' achievement on her own. Next slide, please. And there was, in the kind of aesthetic appreciation that brownstones also began to enjoy in the late 1950s and early 1960s, this generational shift to appreciation of cultural heritage. And this, the Hogwalt building, which is just about my favorite building in all of New York City, the Hogwalt building, would have been torn down if an economically kosher idea of adaptive reuse had not been formulated to act as a political and economic foundation for historic preservation. So we have this very interesting situation in historic districts and around individual historic landmarks. If their economic value can be maintained or raised by historic preservation, by finding new uses for those old buildings, let's do it, right? The city government said, let's do it. And so we have this generational cultural shift, but also the elaboration of a business-friendly understanding of how old buildings can be sustained with new uses. And that was, pretty much laid the groundwork for all of the big stores going into Broadway near the Hogwalt building, and transnational luxury boutiques filling historic storefronts in Soho as in other areas. Next slide, please. We also have artists themselves who become nonprofit or for-profit entrepreneurs. That picture on the left is a very famous picture of the artist Gordon Matta Clark and his two partners in buying a diner that had fed factory workers in Soho until the beginning of the 1970s, and replacing it with the conceptual restaurant they called Food, which enjoyed an excellent reputation for transforming Soho, at least that part of Prince Street, and eventually, by extension, all of Soho, into an artist community and an artist district, even though it did not exactly have legal status as an artist district. And you could say, well, this was a nice example of unslumming, where a workers' restaurant becomes a conceptual artist restaurant, which sold very low-priced food, although that food was too expensive for some of the artists who came to work in Soho. And you also have to ask, what happened to Doris? And what happened to the workers whom she fed in this restaurant? By 2010, Green Street, which is not the same site that we see in the left-hand picture, but Green Street had become this cobblestone thoroughfare of high-priced luxury boutiques. So, we have to wonder what, as Susan asked, what mechanisms could have been put in place to keep the human scale of these old buildings and allow, as has been allowed, a selective infill of new buildings among these historic buildings, all at human scale, without transforming the content of these buildings to high-priced luxury boutiques. In other words, what we have looking at these two photos is globalization from below on the left in the early days, and globalization from above on the right with Louis Vuitton and its ilk. How could we keep the globalization from below while permitting a bit of the globalization from above? How could we improve the investment climate to enable financial means to sustain these old physical structures without allowing the upscaling to take over the neighborhood? Next slide, please. So there are all these ways that what happened in Soho and what was fought over in the rezoning of 2021 connects to Jane Jacobs' writings and Jane Jacobs' work. The question is, and particularly I want to take my hat off to Community Board 2, which not only has been involved in Jane Jacobs' battles and all of the subsequent battles in Soho, NoHo, the West Village, Greenwich Village, and particularly the 2021 rezoning, when Community Board 2 voted almost completely unanimously to oppose the rezoning, but had no effect on the ultimate decision. The Community Board 2 maintains, even though the people who were on the original board and on Community Board 2 when I did the research for my book, Loft Living, in the early 1980s, those people are no longer with us. But Community Board 2 maintains the institutional memory of what it's like to fight on behalf of the community, and maintains the goal of community empowerment. A goal, by the way, as Susan correctly pointed out, that conflicts with the citywide scale, even the regional scale, that is necessary to make more equitable housing opportunities. One community alone cannot do this. There has to be a much larger scale of activism and decision-making for which we have no tools, not in the city planning department or the city planning commission or the city council, but regionally. We don't have the tools, as Governor Hochul recently found out to her regret. We don't have the tools to enlarge the geographical scale of creating housing, nor do we have, as Susan said, the public ownership of land or the public capital to build housing. Instead, we rely, as this city has relied for many years, on zoning, which is not the right tool to decide on who and what fills these buildings. Last slide, please. So, we have a lot of congratulations and self-congratulations here on the part of the Business Improvement District in Broadway, that Jane Jacobs' ideas won, Robert Moses' ideas lost. But what's the content in the software of the architecture? How can we develop the tools, not zoning necessarily, right? Zoning is only a tool for the stones, not for the people, for the bricks, not for the people. How can we develop the tools to make the city a more equitable city and a humane city? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thanks to all of you. Let me ask you a few questions, and we have, not that I'm complaining, we have less time than I was counting on, but that's okay. About some of the assumptions that Jane Jacobs' observations are based on, and Susan touched a little bit on one of these. Jacobs describes the street life of a very particular kind of neighborhood as a normative ideal, and that is a mid-century white ethnic working class in the process neighborhood in the process of gentrifying. So full of mom and pop stores, stay-at-home mothers, artists doing their bohemian thing, and so forth. And I'm wondering to what extent, or can and should, this vision of street life serve as a useful guiding ideal for different kinds of neighborhood, and to be so even today, when the scale at which our social and economic lives unfolds seems so vastly different. It seems that to me that even those of us for whom this idea or this image resonates want to have it both ways. We want a neighborhood rooted in place, but also the convenience of ruthless exchange. A quaint bookstore here, but Amazon. No Airbnb here, but Airbnb in Barcelona, and so forth.
Juan, you have put your finger on a tremendous contradiction between people's aesthetic preferences and their physical and financial convenience. Now, absolutely, even in Jane Jacobs' time in the 1960s, neighborhood stores, groceries, butchers were losing business to supermarkets. So, this is not something that she was concerned with, as far as we know. But the scale of commerce, and both the geographical scale and the ownership scale of commerce, are huge problems that a city finds it hard to fight against. You may remember that in New York City, through the 1990s, there were zoning laws against big box stores. And I guess it was sometime in Mayor Giuliani's rule that that the laws were changed gradually to permit big box stores first in waterfront locations, like that's why Costco I think is on the waterfront in Brooklyn, and then throughout the city. So there would have to be a popular uprising and a change of conscience among elected officials to say, we don't want Amazon warehouses in our municipality. We don't want just-in-time deliveries, and I don't know that that's going to happen. We don't have freestanding butcher stores anymore, except a few.
Yes, we do.
Really?
In fact, what we've seen is kind of the supermarket is going away in New York, and the small boutique kind of grocery store, which I guess was really started by the Korean grocers, has in many ways taken their place, so that in my neighborhood, which isn't far from yours, Sharon, the only big supermarket, which was the Food Emporium, went away, and we have Whole Foods and we have Trader Joe's, but they aren't quite like an A&P or a Stop and Shop. I mean, they aren't like suburban big stores, and of course, malls have never succeeded in New York.
I don't know. I was just at Wegmans on Astor Place this afternoon, and I did see other customers in there. So there are I think there are fewer supermarkets than there were a number of years ago. That's quite true, but I don't see very many artisanal food shops.
Christine has 3 of them close to her: Hudson and Charles, Florence Prime Meat, and Ottomanelli's.
Well, also Dixon's in Chelsea Market, but Chelsea Market is, we have these food halls where there are artisanal purveyors of and even makers of different kinds of foods. But to go back to Juan's question, I don't think we're going to see an abandonment of online shopping and large stores.
Well, my question was partly about that, but it was about a normative ideal that is specific to a particular social composition at a particular moment in time, and that resonates as an image, but that does not necessarily correspond with how different groups lead their lives, and even less so now. So it's about the enduring. The question is about the relevance of this. Is this still useful? Do we want that kind of sociality unfolding in our neighborhoods, or should we abandon that?
Well, I think people want that sociality, or they want some kind of sociality. But you're right in suggesting that Jane Jacobs' ideal was not so far removed from Walt Disney's ideal when he built Disneyland. You know, the idea of Main Street, right? I mean, what Jacobs is talking about when she describes local shopping streets, a subject that I have taken to my heart for a long time, is sort of an idealized vision of small commerce and local frequent provisioning. But that's that's not the kind of sociality we get now. My neighborhood shopping street, which when I moved here, and I live in the middle of Greenwich Village, when I moved here, there was never a butcher until a few years later, but there was a bookstore. There were 2 bookstores. In fact, there were a couple of hardware stores. There were corner diners. There was a bakery and not a candlestick maker, but 2 small supermarkets. All of that has been replaced, although the buildings are still the same. That commerce has been replaced by restaurants, not even grocery stores, but restaurants, a couple of takeout, sandwich shops and grocery stores, but they're not primarily used as grocery stores. And everything else has turned into a restaurant. Now, I used to think that this was only happening in New York, but a few years ago, I developed an international research project on neighborhood shopping streets in Tokyo, Shanghai, New York, Toronto, Berlin, and Amsterdam, working with colleagues in those cities. And we discovered that food stores, particularly, or even more than food stores, restaurants have taken up a larger and larger share of storefronts in all of these cities in Europe and North America. So that must say something about people's shopping patterns, while emphasizing that people like to fill the storefronts in their neighborhoods.
Christine, you were looking to say something before. I don't know if it was a comment about butcher
Well,
store or something.
I was trying to raise the issue away from maybe sociability, maybe small scale butchers and so forth, which I really appreciate in the West Village. That's not the issue. For me, the issue is really there is no physical planning of our cities in America. We do not like planning. And I think that one of the things that can be laid to blame of Jane Jacobs is she was so terribly against planning and architecture. She, I have a nice little quote here that she wrote in Fortune magazine in 1958, and there's not time enough to read it, but she's really calling out the planners who like order and the architects who are playing with little toys and so forth. She was really, really nasty about them. And as a result, we have a divorce between physical planning. Maybe the urban designers have adopted it, or the landscape urbanism has adopted it, but we have a lack of communication between architecture and the planners. I mean, they still don't like each other. And my colleagues don't like planning, and the planners I know don't like architects. And we cannot keep dealing with our cities by zoning, with transfer development rights, with historic districting, with business districts, and so on, overlapping jurisdictions of regulations without any idea of where we're going. And what a plan is to somehow talk about how many butcher shops maybe should a viable neighborhood have, how many bookstores, how many this, how many that. I mean, we don't want to go anywhere near that, but I'm afraid some of the environmental issues are going to push us back to a physical plan when we have no skills to do it. We have no language to talk about between architects and planners. It's yet to come.
That's because planning is, in America anyhow, almost entirely regulation rather than any kind of
but it
envisioning.
Didn't have to be. But getting rid of you also said, fortunately the architects got out of planning, but that's the problem for the cities. Jane Jacobs said a city cannot be a work of art. So go away, you people who think it's a work of art. And
do you think it should be a work of art?
Planners left schools of architecture.
Let me raise it.
I'm hearing two different things. I'm hearing from some of you this idea that physical order is not a very good way to achieve social order. But I'm hearing from Christine the opposite, that there is a connection there. Can you resolve your differences?
Well, I would take a different argument and say that, in fact, New York notoriously doesn't encourage sociability. And in fact, in the building I live in New York, and I've lived there since 1986, which is just north of Union Square, nobody knows each other. While I also live in Connecticut, where everybody knows each other. And that and I grew up in a suburb, and in fact, there's much more sociability in suburban settings than in the kind of setting that Jane Jacobs so idealized. And that in general, I would argue, and I think maybe I'm arguing against Christine, I don't think that the physical environment is very determinative of people's social lives, except maybe big anonymous apartment buildings seem to militate. Even though people are in proximity, proximity seems to produce the opposite of sociability. Although,
well, I was trying to get away from the emphasis on sociability to a different level, rather than to say physical planning has something to do with sociability. That was not my argument.
Let me raise a different question about planning. Whom is one planning for? Are planners supposed to plan for the community as it exists today, the people who live here now? Or are planners supposed to have some vision of growth? And what does that growth depend on? Some of you may know that I've been developing a movie, a documentary film about Soho in light of the rezoning of 2021, working with the documentary filmmaker Alice Arnold. And one of the tormenting questions is that the city planning department seems to be playing catch up with a long period of time when everyone thought that the city's population was decreasing, and there was no way to plan for growth because there wasn't going to be any growth. Somebody alluded to this earlier this evening. So all of a sudden, in the 1990s, city planners in New York began to realize that the population was growing. And then they began to realize that even more, and this was, enhanced by the development of the tech economy after the 2008 financial crisis, when many new businesses, new industries connected with tech, and tech workers began to be more plentiful in New York City. So whom are we planning for? Are we planning for existing residents who may not want change? Or are we planning for a vision of growth that planners or some other people decide is what's coming down the road?
Well, I think that's always the biggest question for planners, is because generally communities are very resistant to change, whether they be urban communities, suburban communities, rural, whatever. And that people like things the way they are, and they're scared of change. And this is a big problem. And planners are not just actually regulators. I mean, many of my students work for former students for community organizations, for housing or economic development entities, rather than for, what's called city planning in New York refers to those people who do zoning plans primarily, but there are lots of other kinds of planning that goes on besides figuring out what should go into which district and what the building height should be. That is, planning is not simply physical planning, or even planning for housing is not physical planning. Actually, the most successful program that New York ever had for housing was when all this abandonment occurred and the city took it over in tax delinquency, and then turned it over to community organizations, and they actually developed a whole lot of housing and saved the Bronx from total desolation. And that, I don't know if you want to call that planning, or it was simply kind of an ad hoc response, but it actually injected a whole lot of money and property into the affordable housing category. Juan, I think there are a lot of people in the audience who want to ask questions, so maybe we should.
We're running out of time, Susan. I was actually I've answered some of them as we're going, and I was going to ask one final question in the hope of sending us off on a positive note. And it connects to this idea of who the neighborhood is for and who we're planning for. But back when Jacobs wrote, these diversity undermining neighborhood changes were driven by local developers and affluent local residents. These days, it's an entirely different ballgame. They're driven by investment and consumer interest at a global scale, which increases not just the amount of money that is flowing into these neighborhoods, but the tendency towards homogenization and the tendency towards a sort of mono business culture, restaurants for tourists or for people from elsewhere, and so forth. If Jacob's recommendations don't help us slow down development the way she intended, then what are the policy alternatives at a local level, be they from planning or from a combination of a partnership between planning and architecture, or from whomever, really?
Well, I think it's more complicated than as you're creating alternatives. That I would make a basic argument that unless you have, in fact, public ownership of land, we're going to have the market making determinations. But what you also see is that consumption patterns change, and people don't necessarily want the same thing as they wanted in 1948 or 1957. And so, yes, there are all these restaurants because people eat out, and people eat out because a lot more because women now work, which they didn't nearly as much back, 50 years ago. And so economic change of people's habits, population growth. So now there's so many old people, which there previously were far fewer of. And so demographic change on a broad scale and economic change in terms of both production and consumption. And when she was writing, we would refer to the advanced industrial countries, and we saw the United States as primarily an industrial country. And we don't see it that way anymore because, China does the industry and we import it and wholesale it and send it through Amazon. And it's a different economic framework. So that in many respects, urban form is a response to these changes rather than anything anybody planned, either because they wanted diversity or they didn't want diversity. I mean, it's a very complicated set of interactions and feedback mechanisms, I guess I would put it.
Christine,
very briefly, it is a very complicated issue, which I would come down to simply say that land matters. Who owns the land? What the property owner is doing with the land, what can be developed, and so forth. We need to have some kind of evaluation over our land policy. Otherwise, we will have the West Village with its super luxurious parks, and we will have other luxurious parks going on the East River, on the east side. We will tear up the park that we have in the Lower East Side in order to build a huge bunker to save so-called resiliency policy. I mean, we have all these ad hoc land-based physical issues of land development without any idea what we're doing. So unless we get the architects involved with the issues of equity, with the issues of distributed justice, of the issue of affordable housing, it's market will take it away as very pessimistic. But I think the issue of environmental control, the environmental crisis is going to push us toward land use planning, and we need that.
Sharon, you want to have
Yes, I think we three agree that the answer lies in a greater government role. As bad as that sounds to many Americans and maybe many New Yorkers, there has to be a central coordinating body that insists on the social value of land, not just the financial value of land, but the social value of land.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We've just about run out of time. One of the questions, Susan, is from Susan from Cleveland, who wants to know which suburb of Cleveland you were referring to.
Shaker Heights.
Shaker Heights.
And well, there's a new book called Dreamtown, which is about Shaker Heights, which is very important in terms of all these issues we talk about, because it was a planned community. It's physically very nice. It's had enormous racial transition and enormous efforts at making that effort toward integration work. And this book goes all about what hasn't worked and what has.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I want to thank all of our speakers and all of everyone in the public for a very stimulating conversation. We'll be having other panels like this in the future. So keep an eye out for those. And I hope you will be joining us again soon.